day 2, and as you can see from the heading on the first slide, today we are focusing on policing-related research and topics, including investigative interviews and other aspects of investigations. So I'll show you just a quick overview of what I intend to cover in sessions 1 and sessions 2 today. We're going to have a bit of a look at what are some aspects of careers in policing, from recruitment, training, retention, management, occupational stressors, and a few items about workplace culture. We're going to talk about profiling as it is used by police, whether it's done internally or by external consultants who might be psychologists. We're going to talk quite in depth about police-community relations and more social psychological research on that topic, including some work on complaints against police and how they should be managed and handled. And then this afternoon, or sorry, in session 2, we'll focus on the interviewing techniques themselves, particularly some research recently on findings from high-stakes interviews with mostly terror-related suspects. And that's where I want you to report back on the video recordings that I asked you to review, because we have other things to discuss this morning. So without further ado then, I'm going to launch into some of the material that I wanted to cover with you, with evidence on careers related to policing. Some work has been done by one of my former students, who now teaches in the criminology department in Tasmania, Loeen Howes, who was really comparing the motivations and interests of people who become teachers versus people who become police officers, and found that there were some striking similarities. But I've just isolated for you some of the major reasons that emerged from her research, on which I was a supervisor and collaborator, regarding why people choose careers in policing. And you'll see that they're quite unexpected, many. I mean, some thought that there would be great career opportunities in the police service and opportunities to enjoy your work because it is engrossing work. Others were motivated more by pragmatics and just needed the salary that's associated with it. Others had very altruistic motives about crime prevention and keeping society safe. Some had simply been persuaded by members of their family or friends, that this was the kind of career they should slot into. And others really opted for the career by default because there weren't a lot of other available options, and there are good entry opportunities and good training opportunities for people to go into policing without necessarily having to have any other formal education at a tertiary level. I think that model in policing is rapidly changing. For example, in the Norwegian police force, all police officers must have a bachelor's degree. I think other policing forces are trying to shift to that model as well. And so what we're seeing is quite a change in the organizational dynamic and culture in policing departments across the globe. And so it's not only the senior level executives who are going to have tertiary education, but it may become an entry level prerequisite. And of course, that has some implications for organizational culture and change, and the kinds of training and incentives that are provided and who it attracts. A few years ago, the New South Wales Police Force asked a number of us, myself and some colleagues when I was at UNSW, to do some work on what really were the essential skills of frontline police officers, the people who really do all of the contact with members of the public. We parse those out as physical kinds of components, you know, you have to be able to run so fast to pursue a suspect, you have to be able to tackle people and arrest them, and so those components were quite clear and concrete. But the psychological skills were a little more subtle, and so I've just reported here what our findings were in terms of the essential psychological skills, at least in the Australian leading and largest New South Wales police force. And communication was really a very high priority. You had to be able to communicate, you know, in person with multiple types of individuals, so you had to be very flexible and adaptive and be able to read situations effectively. You also had to be a good problem solver. There were high priorities given to integrity, and sometimes at some stages in our police department there had been prerequisites of integrity testing as an entry level, you know, and sometimes that was accomplished as well by administering the MMPI, you know, which is a psychometric test that includes subscales that indicate the extent to which people are truthful, have integrity or not, and those were used in a way to screen candidates. Definitely respect for authority was important because it's a very quasi-military sort of workplace, and so there's a hierarchy and a clear chain of command that has to be observed. Interpersonal skills related to the communication were important, and often that's social intelligence, and also good acute powers of observation. And emotional stability, so that you're able to withstand some of the stresses and the difficult situations that you encounter in the job, as well as a high degree of conscientiousness. So those were attributes that really constituted a constellation of some of the profile features of desirable police officers. In terms of managing the stressors on the job, a lot of the officers were exposed to treatment or clinical counseling skills that were provided on the staff. So that's typical in most police departments, especially to provide debriefing after critical incidents or traumatic incidents, to provide more coping skills if people don't have those kinds of coping skills already. Certainly when there were situations of acute stress, the research interestingly revealed that the people who seemed to succumb fastest to the acute stress in the workplace or through incidents on the job were people who already had quite a lot of underlying dissatisfaction with their jobs. So they were more vulnerable and more prone to exhibit those acute stress symptoms than others who are happier and more satisfied with their jobs. So that seemed to serve as some sort of buffer against the stressors. And because the police department in our state at any rate has a very high rate of workplace claims for stress, which entitle police to monetary compensation and or to paid retirement for many years, it's a frequently used option invoked by many of the police officers. So the agency has a very acute interest in trying to pre-identify potential candidates who might be vulnerable to workplace stress in an effort to try to mitigate the extent to which they have a very high litigation bill every year to pay out claims for workplace stress. When one looks across the landscape of even opportunities for compensation for victims of crime, it turned out that the police force were the major claimants of all of the available resources for victims of crime where compensation was possible because in the course of, for example, pursuing a suspect, if they tripped and were injured, they used that injury and all of the expenses associated with it as the basis for a claim as a victim of a criminal context and fitted within the statute. So this has led to, all of these monetary issues have led to lots of reforms around workplace compensation claims, victims' compensation claims, really to try to redress what seemed to be an ongoing tide of complaints in that arena legally by police officers. So that has been the context that has motivated much change in our state in those laws. So it's a very good example of how certain circumstances that were not intended in terms of the availability of victims' comp or workers' comp were used in a particular way by certain litigants, resulting in changes to the law to forestall and to stop that kind of litigation action. There are documentation through research about cultural changes that people experience if their attitudes are measured before they enter the police force and within a space of about 6 weeks of hire. Quite a number of their attitudes towards society and to criminals and so on seem to change as a result of exposure to the policing culture in the workplace. So that I think is a very short time period for that to occur, so it shows that it's a very robust and powerful influence. In terms of coping with work stresses, that's a big area of psychological research even outside of policing, but the policing application is an important arena. What people have found that works best are the individuals who seem to be most resilient in the circumstance, but those who really relied a lot on peer mentoring rather than professional services available within their workplace. Individuals who adhered to limitations provided by the workplace on the amount of time that they could be exposed to stressful work. For example, I worked as an expert on a terrorist trial that was tried in Sydney, where a lot of the evidence consisted of quite disturbing or gruesome images that were found to be in common on the hard drives of all of the suspects. And so the police officers who were investigating those claims had to spend hours and hours and months and months reviewing those gruesome images. And eventually the psychological unit within their force restricted their exposure to those images to the early hours of the day, no more than 4 hours a day, and so forth, in order to try to reduce stress-related claims, because they were starting to get stress-related claims from people associated with that large-scale investigation. That information was then useful to me later on in arguing that jurors would be stressed by being exposed to those same images when that evidence was presented at trial. But that's an example of the kinds of limitations that are often imposed in order to protect the workers from the conditions of the job. Definitely black humor was common among effective work groups among themselves as a way to deal with some of the confronting and difficult circumstances that they found themselves engaged in cases. It was clear that individuals who did not use alcohol as a de-stressing mechanism coped better, and there were problems if individuals did resort to self-medication in that way to try to cope. Also, individuals who developed quite careful separation between work and home, and who had their own kinds of rituals, such as taking a shower at the end of the shift, that helped sort of demarcate the end of the stressful work, and they would move on into their regular, non-stressed mode at the end of that, through that ritual. And they were people who engaged in more normalized socialization. The organizational stresses, though, that seemed to make people more vulnerable were things, complaints about low payment, disparate treatment that appeared unfair or inequitable from commanding officers, workload, especially overwork, inadequate resources to do investigations or to do work that was required in a certain time frame. Uncertainty about opportunities for promotion in their careers, so feeling locked into desk jobs or locked into other unattractive duties for protracted periods led to a great deal of stress. And and insensitivity to the skill sets that people had. Assignment, to duties that were not challenging or interesting is very demotivating and ultimately stressful. And so when researchers had polled police officers about one of the most stressful aspects of their job, most interestingly, and this statistic here comes from a US study, attending a co-worker's funeral was the top-rated stressor, nominated by 77% of the officers who participated in that survey. And so, again, that sort of highlights the vulnerability that and a further source, though, of stress seemed to be particular to female police officers. It is a very gendered workplace, was traditionally a male job, and women have moved into a male-dominated arena, and that is often accompanied by a number of stressors. And the kinds of things that have been cited by women who have been questioned were, the lack of co-worker support sometimes from male team members, certainly exposure to discrimination. If you work in the discrimination arena, you will find many cases of police officers coming through the anti-discrimination channels of litigation. Sexual harassment in particular as one of those, which is often triggered by numerical disparities in the ratio of males and females when they become quite extreme. Research has shown, for example, if you have as low as 15% of one gender and 85% of the other, whether it's male or female in either direction, that is just a very ripe kind of circumstance to highlight gender-based tensions and promote sexual harassment. So evening out those kinds of proportions of workers, can alleviate those proclivities. Breaches of confidentiality were a final item cited as particularly stressful for women, whether it was from supervisors or co-workers, etc. The level of trust that they felt that they were working within was important. Okay, so I wanted to highlight at least one case focusing on the post-traumatic stress disorder compensation issues that I alluded to that are common in our state, and how our courts have dealt with this issue. And so this, is not an atypical case, and I think this particular one, the Seedsman case occurred before some changes were implemented in response to the litigation exposure, but it is still the framework that is applied legally. So, there's a duty of care on behalf of the police force as an employer to provide a safe workplace for employees. And then the issue becomes one of taking reasonable precautions so that you can avoid exposing people to the risk of developing psychological conditions or diagnosable psychiatric injuries. And in this case, the real issue of foreseeability of the risk was met because there have been prior instances and cases associated with precisely the kind of circumstance that faced Seedsman. So Seedsman was a woman who had spent, I think, 14 years of her career working almost exclusively in a child maltreatment unit, starting at the age of 23 and continuing on for her entire career. And she was fairly isolated in her work there and had a lot of individual sole responsibility for interviews with the victims, and the numbers were cited in the case of these 200 to 300 that she'd been exposed to over this period. And she did have eventually a medical discharge from service based on diagnosis of PTSD, and she got that discharge a year after the diagnosis. And the real factual issue and controversy in the case was, the extent to which there should have been more prompt attention to her circumstances with the foreseeability of the risk and the stress reactions once known, or the availability of access to treatments once she was exposed to these stressors. And because those issues were found to be lacking, in her case, she was ultimately awarded 125,000 Australian dollars in compensation after she retired. So that, is an invitation really for you to look at what the standards are for this type of claim and how it might play out in your own legal cases, and what the duty of care is, and whether PTSD is compensable in the same way, etc. So that's something some of you might be interested in looking into. But what those types of features of the workplace have prompted other researchers to look at is really the tension that seems to arise between work and home life and getting work-family life balance. And that's been a huge area of psychological research in the last few decades. And I think that what's important about some of the findings here are that the shift work in the policing schedule seems to be a trigger for a lot of work-family conflict. Because, typically in New South Wales, the police are on duty for 12-hour shifts. That's a common model that's applied in many police forces. So it's quite hard, particularly if both the husband and wife, for example, are police officers, and somebody has to deal with the, getting children to school and from school. If you have 12-hour shifts, both of you, trying to juggle your work schedules so that you're both available to do that, or to afford outside help is really stressful. In younger officers, that was a particularly high trigger, as were workload and dealing with issues such as having to maintain a professional face and not being able to expose the emotions that you might be feeling just due to the workplace demands. So that was also a feature. All of those features led to more health complaints and sometimes even quite extreme outcomes such as suicidal ideation on the part of young police officers. So it's not a trivial issue at all, and often leads to a more harsh impact on the female police officers because they tend to leave their jobs at rates that exceed those of their male counterparts when there is incompatibility between the work and the home schedule. Yes?
I just thought that it might be worthwhile at this point to do a kind of I'm ad-libbing to some extent, but a comparator to the kind of issues which have been arising in relation to the police force or whatever, the kind of things which are seen as problems. So if we look at your previous slide where you were talking in terms of the entire structural things about low pay and bad treatment by commanding officers and inadequate resources, this assignment of I don't think so much an assignment of unchallenging duties, but the fact of overworking, like having really, really long hours. So most of our discussions have kind of revolved more around there. And the other thing which is not there in yours, but it figures very majorly in most of the commissions and other people who've been looking at policing in India, has been the politicizing of the police force, requiring the police to do things for whatever the political governors want, like you're asking them to settle up scores. Say if I'm the party in power, then the opposition and the various things that are happening around them or their workers suddenly they start having a more tough time and the police is kind of playing that role. It's amongst these systemic things which kind of surfaces very majorly. What I found extremely fascinating in this is that whilst we have, on a very continuous kind of basis, this, a police person going amok in the sense that you pick up that rifle of yours or the revolver and you go either kill yourself or you kill people around you. So on a very periodic basis, you have cases of that kind coming. And very often, the stressors which sort of bring it forth is that very long hours of work and all of that has caused the person to do it. But the way the discourse around it is more like, this chappie could not cope up, he's inadequate. Not that these are not the sort of work environments in which you should ask anybody to work. So it's that what it does in terms of brutalizing the force or what it does in dehumanizing you, because if you're treated in a manner which is not humane, you sort of act in a manner which maybe is not humane. So I'm very fascinated by, and I think we could do research, and hopefully when we talk about the assignments, some people might want to pick this up. And I'm just sort of saying, from whatever research and reading I've been doing, these are not even issues we are focusing too much attention on. It's more at the systemic level to say, okay, we should give people a better work pay deal. We should sort of otherwise structurally improve. But what we should do to reduce stressors, what is the kind, like I was very fascinated by the shower at the end of the day kind of things, like your shift is over, you have a shower, you change into civil clothes and you go out. The fact that you're in your uniform for way longer than your shift is requiring you to be in, and virtually like the uniform and you become one, is more, and nobody sees it as a reason to separate and what it can do. So I thought that from a very comparative angle, it may be worth it for us to look at the sort of data that you're presenting to us and see how many of these questions are not even questions for us. That's the thought which is kind of coming most majorly for me as I'm listening to. And this business of talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, it will be more seen as so-and-so cracked up. You couldn't cope up with, you're not tough enough to, you're expected to be. If you're in the police, like you're going to see all of these horrible things, but you have to have that stiff upper lip and do what is to be done. So I just thought it might be worthwhile, and maybe other people in the group sort of might want to add in, but I thought it would be worthwhile to talk about a parallel script, because this is what is happening for us largely. And even at the organizational level, where we've been talking about police reforms and what should be done, we've not made great progress. But at least those are acknowledged that there is something wrong here. But what it does to individual persons, how we need to be addressing that individual distress, it's really not even on the cards, is it?
Thank you.
So just to add on what the point which ma'am has already made, because I came across this kind of situation when I was teaching talks, and within talks we have this realm of claims which are pure psychiatric claims. Within there, whenever police officers or firemen have claimed that alright, a certain incident to which they were appointed under a duty has later on caused them this kind of post-traumatic stress disorders. The English courts have very specifically declined to entertain their psychiatric claims, saying, and in fact it is their ratio, that if your employer couldn't have foreseen a physical injury to you, then they are not, it doesn't fall within this realm of duty towards you for your pure psychiatric injuries. And they were exactly taking this line of reasoning, wherein they stated that if you are into police or if you are a fireman, your very nature of the work is such that you must be able to cope.
And it's sort of, you've assumed the risk. It's like an assumption of risk on.
Yes.
Yeah, no, very, very interesting how different courts will deal with that. And I think what has been learned in New South Wales, at any rate, as a result of all of the research generated on PTSD and who's vulnerable to it and who isn't, is that we've learned that individual differences are really unpredictable. So you can have the same two officers, you know, exposed to exactly the same events, and one of them, you know, will certainly be resilient and have the kind of psychological mindset that is not going to succumb, and another individual will be different. And then how you cope with things itself, once the stress begins, becomes a predictor of whether the PTSD develops after exposure to acute stress. So the coping strategies, for example, you know, some people use an avoidant coping style where they try to block things out, or they try not to engage with it, or remember it, or you know, record those things, and others become, especially those who later on become vulnerable to PTSD, are those who tend to focus on the stress and ruminate on it, and a lot of their cognitive energy and emotional energy is absorbed in thinking about the stressful situations, and that ultimately tends to undermine their ability to withstand it. So those are, there are many areas in psychology where we talk about what we call individual difference variables, where two people might respond differently for, you know, factors that are not obvious superficially, and simply responses to stressors is one of those. And so it is quite difficult to do what the police force has been trying to do in terms of pre-screening people for that vulnerability. It's not necessarily going to be an easy job. Yes?
I have a question. During your tenure, whenever you were asked some suggestions, when you were president working in such departments, did you ever had an opportunity to give some suggestions to improve the quality of the officers, especially police officers? And if so, how it was taken up? And is it making any difference? Any research has been done to see that the previous or the post in training improvements were there during your tenure, or even now if you are giving some suggestions or something to improve the quality of your lives?
I have been a consultant asked to do that by the police force. That's not on the stress-related issue, so I can't answer directly about how recommendations have been implemented that I have made, but I think that definitely my colleagues, you know, other researchers, and I would say the leading PTSD researcher and his colleagues in New South Wales is Richard Bryant, and his team's recommendations, I think, have been followed, you know. So I mean, I think there's been great interest in this issue, you know, for various reasons, but I think improvements have been made. And so there are intervention programs that have been started, because early intervention, when you're exposed to stresses, helps to prevent the onset then of later more extreme reactions such as PTSD development.
Because what type of therapies or intervention what you mentioned about here, leave about these, not even a leave is allowed for the police officers to do. And even if it is there, then he has to compensate some other way. So these are the conditions, these are the situations that police officers are facing. In that case, if anything is done on that line, we can think about it.
I would certainly think that what we need to, and my logical next follow-up, and we have Dr. Rao here, and possibly we could have a further conversation on that. But I genuinely think that we firstly need to document better. You know, unless and until you recognize this as something worth focusing attention on, we have not really moved out of looking at systemic. Whereas the system and the individual, like
yes, the person, you know, context, interaction.
Separate. I mean, we have seen the individuals cracking up as a kind of an individual failure. So you do not see as something which needs to be structurally addressed. So I would sort of, for me, the learning would be to like was hoping that possibly maybe Dr. Rao would at some point react. And I'm putting him on the spot, but I think it may be helpful.
Because in my view, many improvements are being taken.
I'm just talking about the fact that he's in the system, so
Yes.
he might have something to sort of insight us in, and inside his view, and to sort of tell us, would this be something we can work on, talk about? Because after we're seeing this course as a, like setting up certain research in other directions, I was more reactive.
Yeah, it's right. Actually, we haven't even begun documenting our experience fully. Nor have we documented, nor have we do not have a structured work agenda, a specified work agenda that has been sustained. We have been adding our work agenda and it's become very unwieldy. The only way, and it's perhaps a very cynical and shorthand way of characterizing how people or police officers cope with stress, inefficiency, brutality, and predatory attitudes towards their constituency is perhaps can be seen as a coping mechanism itself. Taking shortcuts, prioritizing, or inverted priorities. All of these are coping mechanisms, and that police have survived and delivered in such a extremely undefined context speaks to how these coping mechanisms have worked for them. Inefficiency, filtering out unnecessary complaints. All of these are, more than studying how they cope with stress in the typical formal way. One has to understand how they work within an extremely stressful atmosphere, how they sift out complaints, how they sometimes avoid work, how they brutalize certain kinds of people. So I think it's to understand the Indian police and the stress system requires a new conceptual architecture together, not just, these are the mainstream understandings in a more formal, well-structured system. But India perhaps represents a new challenge altogether.
Absolutely, and that's what I felt we should flag out.
I just wanted to add, so in India, investigation and policing, this is done by the same, like police officers. Like, so simultaneously you are investigating officer on a particular case, and you are also tasked with like other jobs, like other duties. Just to give example, because I have interned in a police station. So like in UP, in Agra and all, even like for one police officer there are like for one investigation officer there are like more than 80 to 100 pending investigations, and they are also like tasked with like other jobs like patrolling and other stuff, and less wages, less salary and all. So it's not only that, like they don't even have proper toilets, bathrooms, or other such benefits, like especially female officers. So it's something which is very much shocking, which I saw when I saw them like working the way that they were.
No, thank you for sharing that. That does sound...
Because in US, the department is different. Policing is done by police officers, and investigation is done by different departments.
Right. Whereas in our system, first of all, police perform general duties, and then after a few years they can specialize in investigations. Everyone does, interviews and investigations as part of general duties, but then there are specialists who then become dedicated to that duty. For example, at the detective level, so it might take a few years to be given those sorts of specialist duties accompanied by prior training. So it's an inclusion. Okay, well, thank you for that discussion. I think what I want to just draw together, the conclusion there is that I think there are lots of research opportunities, to try to address some of the recruitment and the retention challenges. There's growing awareness that all of the changes in technology in policing are placing, new demands, whether it's, cameras worn on the body, or special, GPS trackers for certain kinds of offenders, etc. There's a lot of new knowledge that is required. There are not always very clear pathways to promotion that are outlined, or the access to it can be difficult. Cultures of accountability vary from one force to another. And one of my former PhD students was an assistant commissioner of police in Victoria in Canada, who did his PhD on the sharing of information and how that facilitated or impaired police operations across different Canadian police forces, because he had access to those samples. And what he found was that there was both individual as well as institutional organizational unwillingness in different departments to share information. So sometimes people who are leading a certain kind of case or investigation or department even just become an independent silo, and they become laws unto themselves in a way, and don't share that information across departments within their own force, and certainly not across state borders with others or across countries. And so there can be an impairment to crime fighting, prevention, and a host of other things just by virtue of those individual or departmental behaviors. He also saw that workload allocation, leadership strategies, and risk management strategies varied considerably from one department to another. And so, they could either be facilitators or impediments to the operations. So I think there's an enormous amount of research opportunity for people there. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to some discussion about offender profiling, and that would fit into one of those categories of special expertise that is developed by some agents or officers, or sometimes they might hire people who have that expertise externally to come work with them and guide them on specific cases. What's interesting about some of the literature, when you look at the reviews of this work, is that there's been some work that relies on what is called inductive reasoning, and oftentimes people might look at a disorganized crime scene and they make a distinction between whether a crime scene is organized or disorganized, and then try to infer from that what sort of perpetrator there is to try to develop the profile. And so some of this reasoning has been criticized because, for example, some profilers have said, well, it was a disorganized crime scene, therefore probably it's an inexperienced offender who's probably therefore young, and it all becomes quite speculative and probabilistic and not very reliable. And so that type of profiling has not been supported by research, it's not regarded as very helpful. Other types of profiling rely on a different kind of reasoning that is more deductive and specific to a particular offender rather than just a circumstance, such as the inductive version. And there you're usually looking at crime scene evidence in much more detail. And so you have a more tenable hypothesis that develops from it that can be tested in a specific way and falsified or not. And part of the reasoning that is engaged in is to rule out alternative causes. So it's a much more systematic and scientific kind of approach to develop a particular profile. A third type of profiling that you would read about is called a psychological autopsy. Usually this is a retrospective analysis by someone with psychological training to try to formulate an idea as to what happened, after an event, that were the motivating reasons. And that too is being quite heavily criticized as largely speculative and untested in the ways that the inductive types are. There's no end of comment in some communities, such as the United States, about racial profiling, and I think there are many anecdotes showing that it does seem to be applied, and there are a lot of controversies that accompany it, and so I think the difficulty with it that people have pointed to is really the last point on the slide. They're saying that the problem is that not all criminal behavior fits within commonly used profiles, and so it's limited in that respect. There is a version of profiling that has been applied by the FBI and is documented in one of its manuals called the Crime Classification Manual. And the way that works really is more like that deductive type. So they look for the crime scene to see whether there's any evidence of psychopathology. So again, it requires somebody with some insight into what psychopathology is. So we're looking at clinical abnormal kind of psychology training rather than anything else. They classify the type of crime in the first place, and the focus usually is on violent crimes that I've listed there. And they're trying to discern what the motivation is for those particular violent crimes. And then they have 5 dimensions that are used to try to build the profile. And the dimensions that are listed there, are the type of victim, the type of crime scene indicators, whether there's any staging, for example, of a homicide victim after the death, what the forensic outcome findings are, if there's DNA testing or so forth, and other sort of looser investigative considerations. And when all of those factors have been done, and then there are, that seems to have provided some useful results, and so there seem to be ongoing individuals filling those lots as career profilers following that type. The other type is to do statistical analyses using large archival data sets. So you would get all of the data sets for a particular type of crime, such as a homicide or a sexual assault. Go ahead. You want to reach the microphone? Yeah, I can move. Okay, and Australians.
Have you done the other side?
Yes, please.
Okay.
I wasn't hearing.
We're trying to get rid of this echo. Sorry, it must be hard to listen to. Sorry. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So Australians have done a lot of work, for example, on arson profiling. Mostly psychologists who've done this work. And what they have done is take all of the arson archives, and then they have classified the features, particularly of serial arsonists, because it's important to stop the individuals who are repeat offenders. And they've analyzed them in terms of all of the features that I've listed there, and because those seem to be the important predictors. And then that enabled them to discern some subtypes of serial arson offenders. And those are quite interesting. So there are some people who commit arson because they simply want the thrill or excitement. Others, who do it out of anger or rage. Others, who are just bored. And then finally, a group that were identified who seem to get sexual gratification from the fire. And so you can see that, that analysis was helpful in discerning quite a number of different separate profiles that then can be used to further the investigation and prevention. So that line of quantitative work has been quite useful. However, when it comes to presenting this evidence in court, there's not always a slam dunk for the police. And I've listed, drawn from our textbook, some Australian cases showing differences in civil or criminal cases in response to profiling. and whether it really is expertise that meets the standards for an expert witness who has specialized knowledge on a topic outside of the knowledge of laypersons or judges in the case. And so we had a criminal trial in Western Australia in a homicide case where a profile had been developed by a police officer, and he didn't have any training in profiling, although it's quite hard to get training in profiling anywhere in the world. There is a profiling course that is run at Liverpool University in the United Kingdom that seems to generate more of the profilers than any other university department. But he was not an attendee there. And what the court held in that case was that this was simply an opinion. It wasn't any reflection of specialized expertise or knowledge, and it didn't, in this case, actually identify a particular suspect. All it did was identify a class of putative suspects, and therefore it was unhelpful and irrelevant to the particular defendants in the particular case. So on a number of bases, that profiling evidence fell down and wasn't able to be used by the prosecution in support of its case. However, when we look at a civil case, and this again is a negligence case, where there was a claim for psychiatric and physical injury by a member of the public. And what had happened was a prisoner escaped from jail, ran amok, and went into a convenience store, a news agency, and held them up at the cash register. And the woman who was working behind the cash register was pregnant and became distressed as a result of the holdup, went into early labor, and it was a dramatic incident, and the child was brain damaged. And so she sued the police and the Department of Corrective Services for their negligence in not attending to clear profiled features of how escaped prisoners behave. And apparently that profile was sufficiently robust that it should have alerted the police to a foreseeable risk. And so in that case, that information was admitted, and the profiling evidence was entertained by the court to show the negligence of the police service and the Department of Corrective Services.
This is the reverse of what has happened here, because generally you sort of see profiling as
quite unsubstantial.
Yeah, it's generally seen as discriminatory and this kind of marking out people. So this seems to be quite contrary to
that way of looking at profiling. You're in fact saying that you should maintain profiles then. And I'm finding it confusing, because that generally what one has looked at in terms of profiling is that you see it as discriminatory, especially like when you're doing racial profiling or you're kind of marking out a particular community. Like we've had a history of when it's pre-profiling, in a way pre-profiling days, but like a lifetime labeling that you would do, that during the British, we had this whole marking out of certain tribes as criminal. We actually had a law which was brought in which kind of announced that certain such and such people are criminal tribes. And being criminal tribes, there was an entire treatment which was meted out to them. So much so as even, like putting people into protective spaces where they were required to stay. They couldn't really be, moving with people generally. Post-independence, that statute got repealed, but we had something called the Habitual Offenders Act coming. And in the list of people in the habitual offenders was exactly the people who were included in the criminal tribes. So, my association with profiling to an extent is coming from there, where you in a way label an entire group and category of people as having criminogenic tendencies and operating in that manner. what in the first case, the Western Australia case that you have, they haven't accepted the fact that this person is in any which way been disadvantaged by the profiling, because the person who was doing the profiling didn't have the qualifications, if I've understood you right. And in the second case, you're in fact saying, why are you not using profiling? So I'm getting a little confused. If you could sort of clarify that.
Well, I think we put these in the book specifically to show that there was no consistency in the civil versus the criminal cases in terms of the way the courts were addressing the issue. And so, the second case, does have a very different approach, and I don't think those two can be readily reconciled and resolved, and perhaps it's simply the issue of what happens in the civil case versus the criminal case is through a somewhat different standard, and it does look to some degree as if what was going on in the second case was fairly goal-oriented or outcome-oriented to admit the evidence compared to the other. So it raises the question, and we highlighted that further, I think, in the third case we cited, which was about a bail application, where a judge again was presented with more of an individual profile that was more personality based and characterological, and that individual was not a trained psychologist, and those were clearly psychological dimensions or attributes that were being used to produce this profile. And the judge was very much balking and allowing it on grounds of qualification again. So the qualification issue seems to be a threshold issue that is used, and again, asked the question, he said, could someone who's not trained in psychology really offer an opinion that is an expert opinion on someone's personality, character, and future behavior? So those weren't necessarily answered in that case because it was a bail application, but those same issues resurfaced. So I think if we look at the trilogy together, I would say there's on the whole more skepticism about admitting this type of evidence than general acceptance and admission. Certainly in our jurisdiction, yes.
I think in the first two cases where we're talking about the sort of inconsistency, I think
no, because it's also most people sitting behind the entitlement.
So I think that in terms of acknowledging the inconsistencies, the first one seems to be more accusatory, while the second one seems to be more preventive, in the sense that the profiling in the second case is used more to hold the regulatory authorities hostage rather than accuse a particular kind or profile of people, and where that would allow for us to give them a little bit of space to use the profiling to the benefit, or use the profiling at all as a kind of evidentiary tool. Well, in the first one, we're using it perhaps to accuse or not accuse a particular person and hold them to those consequences. And that there, I'd perhaps think that the skepticism would be a lot more in terms of the consequences of using that as an evidence tool.
I think that's a really important point here to distinguish, and I think maybe what really might be unfavorable in the second case, the civil case, is that they even used the word profiling at all. If they simply said, we know that management is aware through past incidents where prisoners have escaped, that what prisoners usually do when they escape in these situations is blah blah blah. And had excluded any notion that this had anything to do with a profile. That evidence, might have been presented in a different light, and that might account for why it's admitted. And so it seems a bit odd that it's called profiling. And I think what you're doing is highlighting the way that the profile itself points to different individuals. So. It's an inexact science, is how most of us regard it, and so there's quite a bit of critique offered on criminal profiling as an endeavor, and a large part of that has come from a colleague in the United Kingdom, Lawrence Allison, who has published quite a lot of systematic reviews of all of the profiling studies, trying to see how well that work holds up to scientific scrutiny.
No, I was basically just responding back, and I suppose my discomfiture is coming from the fact of that it's true that in law we make this distinction between the criminal part and the civil part of law, or and evidently in the civil intervention, it is compensatory to the so-called victim that you're asking that sort of information and data is something that you should have, which guides you in what kind of preventive interventions you make. My discomfiture is coming from the fact of that, for whatever reason, the moment you ask for that sort of data to be maintained, then the crossing over from where it gets used is in itself problematic. It's like the moment you possess it. So to say that, okay, this is how escaped prisoners behave, and hence you should have such like preventive strategies to deal with escaped prisoners, seems unproblematic. But what prevents me, once I have that information in relation to escaped prisoners, to say all escaped prisoners, if you had an escape pass, then the manner in which we will treat you when we apprehend you the next time, or any kind of history of that kind would mark you out in a certain way, you really cannot prevent it from happening. So whilst one is supposed to be a beneficent duty and the other one is a malevolent action, the data from which both are happening is the same. So the moment you permit data to be, sort of you ask for that kind of documentation to happen, you really cannot hold back the other. That is where I was coming from, So then we need to necessarily decide that we will take the risk of its malevolent user and try to deal with it if it kinds of surfaces. But the maintenance of the data is something which we must do. Or on the other hand, we say that no, because there are these inherent risks in maintaining that kind of data, we don't do it at all. Whether we call it profiling or not is not the significant thing. Because it's retaining certain kinds of records. And we can say preventive policing requires that we maintain those records. Once you have been a kind of quote-unquote wrongdoer, and this is to be distinguished from racial profiling, religious profiling, profiling from people coming from certain parts of the world. So let's look at those large structural things and only oust them out, but keep this other one on. I mean, that was the question I was starting. I take your point, and I think it's a valid one. I'm only sort of saying is that when we discuss these things, and that's where, if you look at yesterday's category of where you talk about the psychology of the law, that the moment you start to mark out certain people and you maintain special records about them, it's a kind of thing, Jane, that we have, when you, if you are a juvenile delinquent, what kind of records will be maintained for the individual, and if you will maintain records and you've marked out that person for the rest of their life, irrespective of the fact that you're making this distinction between juvenile and adult crime. So you actually insist upon the fact that all records will be destroyed. There cannot be a history. Because if you retain a history, then its malevolent use cannot be prevented. I was coming from there, basically.
No, I think, it's a really interesting issue as we consider evidence-based anything, to figure out, scientists will argue that the data are neutral and that it's the use of them and the applications and implications applications of them, that requires the skill, and that's where all of the attention and argument should really focus. But you're raising a point that even if the data are neutral, the risk of misuse of them itself, may be so paramount that you need not to maintain. So
at least I want us to think about it, because I don't think it's as simple as all that. Because if I
kind of jurisprudentially understand it, then somewhere your evidence-based or your empirical-based legal studies is kind of pushing law towards a more realist outlook. To say that, listen, you really cannot be content with the precept that you create. Your precept needs to be continually informed by practice. And that seems to be if I have to take an underlying kind of preference of the entire school of thought, then it is saying that you need to be all the time informed by practice. My issue somewhere is this, that if that is the case, then how can we be only informed with one kind? Because suddenly then we are mixing up, we are in the first, we are being informed by the sort of malevolent practice which happens, whereas in the second, we are kind of operating in the realm of precept. We are then asking, all right, how much of this regulatory kind of action is really possible or not?
Sure. I would probably say that we think that empirical legal study says that the law should be informed by research, not exclusively practice, because there is a difference between the effectiveness and the efficacy, of the use of data, and so clearly you can have evidence that gets adopted in an incorrect way, or practice that doesn't really apply the evidence, with any integrity, and so those sorts of aberrations, are probably inevitable. In certain sense, just the way everyone who's trained in law is not going to be a competent lawyer, or a good lawyer, and that doesn't mean you should stop training them. So I think we need to distinguish between what the evidence shows and whether the evidence is solid and good, and the uptake of it. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider risks of some of the uptake. So it's a very, very important discussion. All right. So to wrap up, I just put up a few slides about some really interesting research, really to test some of the profiling skills that Lawrence Ellison and his colleagues did. And what he's argued is that people overrate how useful profiling is. That often the weakness is that they rely on fairly naive notions of psychological personality traits, and that, as we pointed out, those can lead to discriminatory stereotyping that has many negative consequences, and risks are well acknowledged. And so what Lawrence Ellison and his colleagues did was they conducted an experiment where they developed two profiles. One was bogus, not evidence-based, and one was, a real profile that was evidence-based. And they gave them to two groups of professionals. Some were, forensic sort of consultants who did profiling, and others were police officers in the UK police force. And those two groups were mixed, and each of them rated the extent to which they thought that there was a match between an individual profile and either the fabricated offender characteristics, and it was fabricated because the person in no way matched the apprehended offender. And then separately, some of them did a match between the profiler and the offender who was apprehended. And what he showed persuasively was that there was no significant difference in the ratings given to the bogus profile and to the real profile. And he used those data itself, to argue that what was going on was just a psychological process of susceptibility to investigate a bias or confirmation bias, where if you have these traits in a profile, you look for confirming evidence that then you conclude, justifies that profile. And it is just a case of supporting your own pre-existing beliefs selectively from the data that are there. And that similarly, he found that the order in which you look at those evidence also changes the extent to which you think profiles are present or absent. And so his conclusion was that none of this information really met what we consider to be the Dorbert type standard, drawing on the United States case from 1993 about what sort of evidence really is robust enough to become expert evidence in court. Australia doesn't use that standard because it's not Australian case law, but most judges around the world are very familiar with what the Dorbert principles of robust data are. And so they often comment about it or discuss it or imply it in some way. So it was quite legitimate for Lawrence Ellison and his team in the United Kingdom to talk about what sort of standard is a reliable threshold for expert evidence, and he found that the profiling was wanting. So that, things may evolve. The profiling science develops, and some of it may be better than others and have other uses. But in terms of expert evidence, particularly to convict someone in a criminal case, it is generally regarded as wanting. All right, so I'm going to move on to the third topic in the next 15 minutes, which I want to cover quite a bit about, and that's to focus on really community relations with the police and research that has been done on what makes a police force appear to be more trustworthy, more legitimate, what makes people comply with law enforcement officers, directives, or not comply. And this comes from research as well in the past about different types of corruption. In Australia, when there was a royal commission that looked into police corruption, that had a huge impact on the integrity of policing today. They found that there were two kinds: noble cause corruption, where people were basically, faking the evidence to convict someone that they knew was a criminal and an offender, as well as traditional types of evil corruption, which was the kind where people simply abused their office and their authority and was susceptible to taking monetary bribes, and so on, for other reasons. And when people have looked at corruption or reasons why there might be lower trust in the police, oftentimes they pick on individuals, so similar to what we've been discussing about many topics, the focus on the individual as if it's totally internally caused individual features, and someone is a bad apple, not an officer with integrity, or else, it's just one particularly bad department that has a negative police culture that promotes corruption, and there hasn't been a very sophisticated analysis of the causes of those difficulties. And so there has been some research that has focused on causation using more of that person in a situation interaction. That has yielded other kinds of results. And they have shown that what is called opportunistic analysis really highlighted causal pathways. And that if you took the opportunities away, then you could decrease the incidence of corruption dramatically. So if you focused on internal procedures, for handling things like drugs, cash, and property, if you changed the incentives in police performance management so that people were not rewarded for convictions or for those kinds of case outcomes rather than for quality of work, then you could reduce corruption. Similarly, certain integrity tests had positive effects. Constant computer audits that weren't personally targeting specific individuals, and also complaints analysis. So a host of things have been effective in showing that it's not just an individual, but the context in which that individual operates that makes people more or less trustworthy. As an example of legislation that you might want to compare in your own community, you can look at what sort of whistleblower protection acts there are, because one of the huge obstacles to the Royal Commission in Australia was that officers simply, who were very well aware of corruption, would not come forward and say anything about what their counterparts who were corrupt might be doing. And so there are all of these provisions in our Whistleblower Protection Act that are intended to change that and provide more protection for people who do come forward. There's been quite a lot of empirical study on whistleblowers who do come forward and how that plays out in their careers. What I wanted to focus on in the last portion of the session is really taking some research into practice and showing how some findings that are empirical about police complaints can be implemented by a police agency to create institutional change where certain problems have been recognized. So this is some research on an evaluation of the New South Wales Police Force customer service program that included a charter of how police officers should behave towards their customers, drawing on a model that comes straight out of the marketing world that was pretty much adopted into the police force, with some tensions because there are differences between commerce and law enforcement that were not always clearly acknowledged. But the aim of the analysis was to try to see the extent to which literature on procedural justice and other contemporary issues about customer service might help make this program more effective, and then to identify, by analyzing the types of complaints that were made about the police, what sort of situations were more likely to lead to problems and risk, particularly risk of litigation exposure, that might cost the police a lot of money, and that might offer opportunities for more training. So I'm going to quickly work through the main aspects of this study for you. The theory that was underpinning this is procedural justice theory. How many of you are familiar with that? No hands raised. It comes out of psychology and social psychology, and the major proponent is Tom Tyler, who's based in New York, and he has done this kind of work for decades, and it's been taken up by police forces around the world now, and is very popular as a theoretical framework for policing in Australia as well. And what its tenet is that there is more cooperation with police and more attributed legitimacy when you focus on how police treat people in their citizen or suspect interactions than when you focus on the outcomes. In other words, treatment is more important than whether or not someone is arrested or whatever the outcome might be. And that perceptions of fairness are based on the treatment, not the outcome. Okay? And so this fits very nicely with the shift that has occurred across the globe away from force-based policing to consent-based policing and the notion of community-based policing. And the reason that complaints against the police become important in this context is that they're one measure of trust in the police service. And of particular interest always is how the police treat the minority group members in society at large, because those are a sort of barometer for how other people perceive police treatment in general. And so if there is satisfaction by minority groups who are often on the outsiders with how they are treated by police, you can generally use that as a predictor of satisfaction in the overall community. So it's quite a powerful, robust theory. What are the key components of procedural justice? Well, there are four. And those are trustworthiness, respectful treatment, neutrality, and voice. And there's quite a lot of sources of definition for that. And it is important to understand how they are unpacked. So trustworthiness means that when the police interact with someone, they have their best interests at heart. You know, not, for example, a police officer's motivation to get another quota filled on arrests or tickets or whatever the incentives might be, but they are genuinely interested and convey sincere interest to the citizen. The respectful treatment is more readily understandable, but that is demonstrated respect, consideration, politeness, all of those sort of civil attributes. The neutrality is the absence of bias, so absence of differentiated treatment, not targeting certain selected individuals for harsher treatment, whatever the issue is. And voice is really giving the citizen or the suspect an opportunity to provide an account, to be heard. So those principles apply to marketing just as much as they do, in fact, to policing. They apply in a wide variety of situations. And what the research by Scogin in the UK, for example, using these kinds of theories has shown, is that when people have a negative experience in a police community member interaction, the force of that is really great. In other words, it's 4 to 14 times the impact of a positive experience. So it reverberates and has implications that are much harder to control, emphasizing the importance of trying to minimize those negative events. So what we did in the study was we got a 1-year sample of complaints as they came into what is called in New South Wales the cat's eye system, which is a sort of a neutral, anonymous system where complaints are registered, whether they're phoned in or written in or made orally to a police officer who is then obligated to report them in writing in the cat's eye system. So the sources were various, and so we had this 12-month period, and there were almost 3,000 that we analyzed of different sorts. We didn't have the underlying documentation, just what was recorded in the computer management system to deal with these complaints. We coded them, you know, as best we could in different ways. We also coded every incident for how much legal risk there was, and the high numbers, you know, indicated more risk. And we based that on tort law and an analysis of risk matrix out of tort law. And we found that there were, in fact, about 101 different types of police behavior that constituted the basis of one of those 3,000 or so reports when we classified them. We did some inter-rater reliability to check that our coding scheme was robust. And we compared our results with an evaluation that had been done before called the mystery shopper kind of evaluation. Again, you can see the marketing difference. So they had fake complainants, you know, make a complaint to the police and then, or come in, you know, in this case, oftentimes they're like somebody complaining about a barking dog, and then they're usually quite trivial and silly sort of incidents rather than core policing activities, and then they monitor how the police respond to those events. And those produced quite positive results for the police in a follow-up phone survey, whereas our results were more mixed. What we found was that the police had a lot of misconceptions about who complained. They thought that most complaints were lodged by women. In fact, they were mostly by men. They thought that most complaints were non-meritorious. We found that the number of non-meritorious complaints in the 3,000 sample was very low. They thought that most were from suspects, not from women, most of the others were from suspects seeking revenge for arrest. We found that that was also not the case, that most complaints were from non-suspects. And they thought that customer service did not apply to the core policing duties because in the charter in New South Wales, the customer service program was said to apply to everyone except a suspect. So it applied to everyone except those who are engaged in core policing customer interactions. So we were very critical of the exclusion of suspects from anyone who is entitled to good customer service by the police. And when we analyzed those by procedural justice features, we found that in fact, 88% of the 3,000 complaints mentioned an attribute of procedural justice in the content of the complaint. And they seem to co-occur also with high-risk complaints about 50% of the time. And so we had a very different view of what was going on in the complaints arena. They entered the police based on their earlier evaluation. And so I will jump to one or two key issues, and you can go through the rest of these slides at your leisure when you get them. Part of what we thought was critical was to educate the police that in fact complaints should not be nullified. Their entire complaint management program was targeted at removing complaints and reducing the number. And what we argued was that in fact complaints are a critical way for people to engage with the police, and that there is a curving linear relationship between customer satisfaction and the number of complaints. So when you have an optimal situation, that's really at the peak there, your loyal customers, those who trust you and who think there's any purpose in engaging with you, are the ones who are going to have the gumption to register a complaint. Those people who don't trust you are never going to front up and make a complaint. So the absence of complaints might lead to a total misinterpretation of the satisfaction of the customer base, if that's your community. And so low complaints is not necessarily good. It might be an absence of complaints, but it also might be entirely the opposite. So what we tried to persuade the police was that they should be encouraging people to complain, because that would give them more information about how they were performing, rather than discourage people from complaining, which was the way the entire program operated. And I will...
I presume this would hold good for all people. I mean, any service, one should be encouraging.
That kind of interaction. Absolutely. There's nothing different about what you want to do with the police than what you want to do if you're a CEO of a large corporation or if you're managing a law firm, etc.
Yeah, are you teaching in a university? In the sense that if you don't get feedback, or people feel there's no point in giving feedback or complaining, because anyway nobody's going to do anything about it. So then I suppose there's greater disaffection when there is no complaint than when there is complaint.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Because when you're giving a complaint, you're still having a hope that something can be set right. If you feel that nothing is going to set right, then you feel it's a waste of time to complain.
Absolutely. That's the essence of what has come out of other work in other areas. Yes, sure. You want the microphone? Yeah, just pass it down. I'll just jump to.
So my question is, how do you reconcile this theory with, say, a political or sociological issue that a community might be facing? So like my suspicion is that, could it be possible, this theory, this idea that if more minorities or members of the minority community are face a discontent with the way the police system works and they complain, that would result in like a dissatisfaction with the general public as well. So could that also work in a reverse effect? So like an example would be like the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. You also have this All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter movement that came, and that only came after the Black Lives Matter sort of started rising. And you still have this major discontent with the majority group because minorities decided to come out and question the police system. So in a way, it kind of worked in a reverse method, in the sense that you have people defending their rhetoric and defending their idea and their narrative, and seeing the minority discontent as more of an exception and as a rebellion, as opposed to a general discontent that everyone should be questioning. So could it be possible this works in a reverse way as well? Is what my question is.
That's a great question. What do the rest of you think? I mean, you know, when you have a question like that, I think one of the things I would hope you would learn to do is to say, is this an empirical question? Is this something that one can solve by data? How can we best answer it? You know, so do you think that yours is an empirical question?
I would say it could be in the sense that
Take the mic, so.
I would say that it could be. Again, I don't know entirely, but one study that I have read showed that if you look at a majority of the white individuals that were taken into the study, they were either neutral or they saw the police force in a more favorable light because of particular instances only coming out in the media as opposed to more of a holistic picture being shown. Whereas the majority of discontent was either by minorities in the United States. So I guess my question is it possible that complaints could work in this manner where it's specific and targeted but not, because it sort of reflects a general political or sociological issue that the community is also facing, which is anti-minority rhetoric possibly. So it could be empirical, I think.
Well, it's testable with data help to answer it. I mean, I think one of the tricky things about the circumstance that you're drawing on there is that there are so many sub-communities. You know, sort of generalizing about what's going on in the U.S. as a coherent body is extremely difficult. You know, when, are we talking about, minority groups and majority groups in a specific jurisdiction? All of those are nuances that we want to explore. But I think that's, a very good provocative question. And so, interested in what others think. Yes, do you want to comment on that?
You asked Sarah if it could be solved through empirical data, and I think it could be solved through empirical data and has been solved through empirical data in certain areas. In fact, the Los Angeles police force collected statistics as to the kinds of shootouts that happen with respect to certain communities, and using the statistics, they help educate the police force and teach them how to act in certain situations. So I think statistics in this sense could actually help change the view of a lot of, as Sarah was saying, like a lot of white Americans feel that there isn't a police problem, but if you do have solid data and statistics to show that there is a systemic problem of racism within the police force, I feel like the whole Black Lives Matter movement would get bolstered and it could help show that there does exist this kind of phenomenon that's happening. And the whole reason why the rhetoric of Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter comes up is because there isn't enough and legitimate data that exists for the entirety of the states. So I do think this is a problem that can be fixed by empirical study, and it has been done in Las Vegas or Los Angeles. I'm not sure yet.
And that's a very interesting and large police department that is. Trying to be as evidence-based as they can. All right, we're out of time for the session, so thank you all for your contributions, and I will be back in half an hour. Okay. And please be ready to comment on the videos that we set for you.
everyone.
Today?
Yeah, every day.